Chapter 1. The severing. The stone chamber is cold, not the crisp cold of winter mornings, but the damp suffocating cold that seeps into bones and settles there like a diseased torchlight flickers against walls slick with condensation, or perhaps something darker in the center of the room. Iron chains rattle. A man kneels, wrists locked in restraints, bolted to the floor. His breathing comes in ragged gasps, each exhale a prayer that goes unanswered. The executioner enters without ceremony. He carries no grand axe, no gleaming sword. Instead, he holds a blade dull, unpolished, stained with rust and memory. This is a tool designed not for mercy, but for spectacle, the kind of instrument that makes a point slowly, deliberately. The prisoner's eyes widen. He doesn't speak. Perhaps he has already been silenced. Perhaps he knows words won't change what is coming. The guards lining the walls shift uncomfortably, but they do not look away. They've been ordered to watch, to remember. The blade rises. The sound that follows is not clean. It is splintering wet, a symphony of cartilage and tendons surrendering to iron. His scream pierces the chamber, echoing of stone swallowed by shadows. The first hand falls to the floor with a dull thud. Blood pools beneath it, spreading like ink across parchment. Then the blade rises again. When it is finished, the executioner steps back, wiping his hands on a cloth already soaked through. The prisoner slumps forward, trembling, his arms ending in ragged stumps wrapped hastily in filthy linen. The guards exchange glances, one of them younger than the rest whispers something to his companion. Is it done? The older guard shakes his head slowly. They see Mutter's eyes fixed on the broken man before them. This is only the beginning. Beyond the chamber door, footsteps echo down the corridor. Orders are being prepared, arrangements made by dawn. The city will wake to something far worse than the severing of hands. The executioner knows it. The guards know it, and somewhere deep in his fading consciousness, the prisoner knows it too. His suffering was never meant to end here. It was meant to crescendo. Chapter 2. Bloodline of Shadows. To understand how a man ends up chained in a torture chamber, you must first understand the family that brought him into the world. This was no ordinary lineage. It was a dynasty built on whispers, watered with blood and pruned by paranoia. Every generation seemed to inherit not just titles and land, but a curse and invisible rot that hollowed out trust and turned fathers against sons, brothers against brothers. He was born in the dead of winter during a blizzard so fierce that midwives refused to travel. His mother labored alone, attended only by a single servant, too terrified to flee. When he finally emerged, blue-lipped and silent, no one celebrated. The astrologers later claimed they saw omens that night. A comet splitting the sky was howling in patterns that spelled doom. Whether true or fabricated, the story stuck. His father, the ruler, barely acknowledged his birth. There were already heirs, stronger, older, more legitimate in the eyes of the court. This child was an afterthought, a spare in a family where spares rarely lived long. The court historians would later note his existence in footnotes. If at all born in the year of storms, one entry read, lived in shadow. But shadows, as it turns out, are where the most dangerous games are played. The dynasty he belonged to was infamous across the known world. Neighboring kingdoms spoke of it in hushed tones. Traders avoided its borders, and emissaries returned with stories that seemed too grotesque to believe until the next story proved them true. Poisonings at banquets, drownings in locked rooms, heirs who vanished on hunting trips and were never found. The official records blamed bandits, illness, accidents. The truth everyone knew wore a crown. His childhood was a study in survival. He learned early that affection was dangerous, that laughter drew attention, that even silence could be interpreted as conspiracy. His tutors were rotated frequently. Some disappeared between lessons, others were reassigned to distant provinces. He never asked why. Asking questions was the fastest way to become a question yourself. Religious factions divided the court. Some backed the old faith, others championed reform. His very existence became entangled in theological debates. He didn't understand. Was his mother's marriage legitimate? Were the rites performed correctly? Different precepts gave different answers, and each answer carried the weight of treason or legitimacy. By the time he reached adolescence, he had become a ghost in his own palace. He attended feasts, but sat at the far end of the table, He walked the halls, but servants averted their eyes. He existed in a state of suspended relevance, too connected to eliminate outright, too inconvenient to embrace. But the real threat, the one that would eventually lead him to that stone chamber, didn't come from rival heirs or ambitious clerics. It came from the man who gave him life, his father. The ruler had begun to change, age perhaps, or guilt, or the slow poison of absolute power seeping into his mind like groundwater through cracked foundation. He started seeing threats everywhere, in the way a courtier smiled, in the timing of a messenger's arrival, in the flight patterns of birds outside his window. And when paranoia takes root in a king's mind, everyone becomes suspect, even his own blood. Chapter 3. The unseen war power in its purest form is invisible. It doesn't announce itself with trumpets or banners. It moves through glances, through carefully chosen words, through the strategic absence of words, and in a court where the ruler's mind had begun to fracture, that invisible power became a weapon wielded by everyone. The factions didn't declare themselves openly. There were no badges, no public manifestos. But everyone knew the old military generals, scarred and skeptical, clustered in the eastern wing. The reform-minded clerics held their study circles in the library's upper floors. The merchant princes, newly wealthy and newly influential, through lavish dinners where alliances shifted like sand beneath silk tablecloths, and caught between them all a young man whose only crime was being born into relevance. He never asked for, he tried at first to remain neutral, to be invisible. But in a game where every player must be sorted into friend or enemy, neutrality itself becomes a position, a threatening one. Letters began to circulate, anonymous, unsigned, impossible to trace. They spoke of midnight meetings that may or may not have occurred, of secret pacts between unlikely allies, of plans to restore balance or ensure stability, phrases that could mean anything, and therefore meant treason. His name appeared in some of these letters, not as a conspirator, not yet, but as a symbol, the spare. They called him untainted by the succession wars. Some factions saw him as a blank canvas onto which they could project their ambitions. Others saw him as a loose thread that, if pulled, might unravel everything. The ruler, his father, began summoning him more frequently, not for conversation. The old man had stopped trusting conversation years ago. Instead, he would sit in silence, eyes fixed on his son, watching for signs, a nervous twitch, an averted gaze, anything that could be interpreted as guilt. The young man learned to sit perfectly still, but stillness, too, would be suspicious. The palace, a secret police, an informal network of informants, interrogators, and shadow operatives began to take interest. They followed him through the gardens. They questioned his servants. They intercepted his correspondence, reading between lines that contained nothing but banalities about weather and health. One night, his closest confidant, a childhood friend who had risen to a minor administrative post, failed to appear for their usual evening walk. The young man waited in the courtyard for an hour. Then, two, finally, a servant approached, eyes downcast. "He's been reassigned, my lord, to the northern provinces." It was a lie. They both knew it. The northern provinces were where people went to disappear, where the cold and distance erased inconvenient truths. The young man returned to his chambers and bolted the door for the first time in his life. He understood with absolute clarity. He was already condemned. The trial, the accusations, the evidence, those would come later, formalities to justify a decision already made. Somewhere in the palace's labyrinthine corridors, someone was forging the documents that would seal his fate. Somewhere a witness was being prepared, coached on what to say, what to remember, what to forget. The invisible war had chosen its next casualty, and invisibility, he realized too late, had never been protection at all. Chapter 4, marked for ruin. The document arrived on a Tuesday. Not to him, he would never be granted the courtesy of seeing his own accusation. It arrived on the ruler's desk, carried by a messenger whose face betrayed nothing, delivered with the weight of revelation, a confession, written in shaky handwriting, signed with a name. He recognized one of his mother's distant relatives, a man he'd met perhaps twice in his life. The confession detailed the plot meetings in abandoned chapels, coded messages, hidden in grain shipments, plans to remove the tyrant and restore rightful order, and at the center of it all, orchestrating from the shadows him. Every word was a lie, but lies when wrapped in the parchment of official testimony, when sealed with blood-red wax, when presented to a mind already sick with suspicion, become indistinguishable from truth. The ruler read it 3 times. Then he summoned his inner council, not the full court, not the public advisers, but the men who did the work that could end be written in history books. They convened in a room without windows, lit by candles that cast more shadow than light. "Is it credible?" the ruler asked. The spymaster, a thin man with ink-stained fingers, nodded slowly. "The handwriting has been verified. The witness is in custody and has repeated his testimony under questioning, under torture." He meant under conditions where men would confess to anything, to witchcraft, to consorting with demons, to plots that never existed. But the ruler didn't ask about methods. He never did. "And the prince unaware, your majesty?" He continues his routines, perhaps too calmly. Though it was the trap of existence in a paranoid court. React with fear, and you are clearly guilty. Remain calm, and your composure is proof of sinister confidence. There was no right answer, no safe path. Place him under observation quietly. Within hours, his world began to contract. Servants who had served him for years suddenly requested transfers. Guards who once nodded in greeting now watched him with stone faces. Invitations to court functions stopped arriving. His chambers, once located in the palace's residential wing, felt suddenly like a cell with unlocked doors. He noticed, how could he not? One evening, he attempted to visit the library, a neutral space, he thought, where surely he could find some refuge in ancient texts. But when he arrived, the doors were barred. Renovations, the guard explained, though no workers were visible. No sounds of construction echoed within. He tried the gardens next. They at least had always been open. But as he walked the familiar paths, he realized he was being followed. Not closely, they maintained a professional distance, but the message was clear. Privacy was a privilege he no longer possessed. Desperation drove him to reach out to old allies. He penned careful letters phrased in the most innocent terms possible, asking for nothing more than advice, company reassurance. Most went unanswered. One recipient, a military commander he'd once thought friendly, replied with a single line, "I regret I cannot assist you in these matters." The translation was obvious: "You're already dead. I won't die with you." The final blow came on a moonless night. He woke to the sound of boots in the corridor, multiple pairs moving with purpose. He sat up in bed, heart hammering, as the door to his chambers burst open. Without warning, the secret police had arrived. They didn't speak, they didn't present charges. They simply moved with the efficiency of men following orders. They'd followed 100 times before his wrists were bound, gently, almost courteously, as if they were still pretending this was something other than an arrest. "Where are you taking me?" he asked. The lead officer met his eyes briefly. There might have been pity there, or perhaps just exhaustion. "Somewhere you can answer questions, my lord." Questions, the word hung in the air, heavy with implication. In this court, questions weren't asked in parlors over tea. They were extracted in rooms without windows, rooms designed for breaking rather than conversation. As they led him through the palace's back corridors, routes used for removing bodies, for disposing of evidence, he passed a mirror. His reflection stared back, a young man in nightclothes, wrists bound, surrounded by armed guards. He looked exactly like what he was, a prisoner of a system that had already decided his guilt. The only question remaining was how much he would suffer before they made it official. Chapter 5. The pit of questions. The descent into the palace's lower levels felt like descending into hell's waiting room. The air grew colder with each step, thicker, saturated with moisture and something else, the metallic tang of old blood, the acrid bite of fear that had soaked into stone over decades. The interrogation chamber was surprisingly clean. Someone had recently mopped the floors. Fresh torches burned in their sconces. A wooden chair sat in the center of the room, bolted to the floor, its armrests worn smooth by countless hands that had gripped them in agony. They didn't force him into the chair immediately. First came the questions. "Do you know why you're here?" He did, but admitting that felt like confession. Now you've been named in a conspiracy against the crown. Multiple witnesses have testified to your involvement. They're lying. The interrogator, a man whose face bore the resigned weariness of someone who'd heard every denial, every plea, every prayer, simply nodded. Everyone says that at first. The questions continued, hours of them, circular, repetitive, designed not to extract information, but to exhaust, to confuse, to create contradictions that could be exploited. Later you met with Lord Cadwin in the 3rd month. Yes, at a public feast, and you discussed the succession. We discussed the weather. Perhaps the harvest. I don't remember. You don't remember. Interesting. Every answer was wrong. Every silence was damning. The interrogator recorded everything in a ledger, his quill scratching away like claws on coffin wood. When words failed to produce the desired results, they moved to persuasion. The first device was simple iron clamps designed to crush fingers. They started with his left hand, applying pressure slowly, incrementally, giving him time to reconsider his denials. Between each turn of the screw he screamed, "There is no dignity in torture, no brave silence that lasts. Pain in its purest form strips away everything but the animal self, the creature that wants only for the hurting to stop. Confess, and this ends." But confess to what? A plot he knew nothing about. Names he'd never heard. If he lied, they'd demand details he could provide. If he told the truth, they'd call it obstinacy. There was no path forward, only deeper into suffering. They moved to boiling water, next slow drops onto bare skin, each one a small sun of agony. The pain so intense, it didn't even register as heat at first, just wrongness, a violation of body and reality. The names give us the names. There are no names. There is no plot. The interrogator sighed, almost sympathetic. That is the problem. You see, we know there are names. Your refusal to provide them only proves your guilt more deeply. It was madness, perfect, circular, inescapable madness. Days blurred together. Or perhaps it was hours in a room without windows, without natural light. Time became another instrument of torture. They fed him enough to keep him conscious, not enough to grant strength. They let him sleep, but only in brief intervals, jolting him awake just as his mind began to settle into rest. And then came the order that made even the torturers hesitate. The lead interrogator received it via sealed message. He read it twice, then looked up at his colleagues with something almost like regret. The hands, both of them. The king wants it done properly. The executioner was summoned, the same man with the dull blade, the same tool of spectacle. Rather than mercy, they strapped the prisoner down, though by this point he barely had the strength to resist. The blade rose, the first hand separated with that same wet splintering sound. The second followed. They wrapped the stumps in linen, cauterizing the wounds with hot iron, not out of mercy, but to prevent him from dying before the king's true punishment could be administered. When they finally dragged him from the chair, leaving him in a cell barely large enough to lie down in, he drifted in and out of consciousness. Fever set in, infection probably, the kind that would kill slowly if left untended. They tended it, they kept him alive, because the severing of his hands, the days of torture, the extraction of confessions that were never given, all of it was preparation. The real punishment was still to come, and it required him to be alive, conscious, and aware when the entire city gathered to watch. Chapter 6. The public lesson. Dawn broke over the capital with unseasonable cold. Frost clung to cobblestones, and breath misted in the air like departing souls. But the cold didn't stop the crowds. They began gathering in the main square hours before sunrise, staking out positions near the central platform, the same platform used for royal proclamations, market festivals, and executions. Today would be all three. The heralds had announced it the previous evening. A traitor to the crown will face justice. All citizens are commanded to witness, commanded, not invited. Absence itself could be interpreted as sympathy, and sympathy as complicity. By the time the sun crested the eastern walls, the square was packed. Merchants closed their stores, craftsmen abandoned their workshops. Even the beggars, usually ignored, found themselves swept into the crowd, forced to bear witness. The platform had been prepared with disturbing care. Fresh wood, newly varnished iron restraints polished to a shine, and in the center a device that many in the crowd had never seen before, though they heard whispers of its use in distant provinces. It resembled a wooden frame, almost like a door lying flat, with straps and pullers attached, and recognized it the rack, an instrument designed not for quick death, but for slow methodical destruction. The kind of torture that could last hours, bones dislocating one by one, ligaments tearing like wet fabric. A murmur rippled through the crowd. This wasn't a simple execution, this was a message. The palace doors opened. First came the guards, 2 lines of them, halberds raised, creating a corridor through the crowd. Then the priest, not the reformist clerics, Udi whispered of mercy, but the old guard, the ones who believed in divine punishment and earthly consequences, and then supported by 2 guards because he could no longer walk on his own, came the prisoner. The crowd fell silent. He was barely recognizable. Days of torture had hollowed him out, left him a skeleton draped in bruised skin. His arms ended in bandaged stumps, the linen already stained through his head, hung forward, chin resting on chest, as if he lacked the strength even to observe his own fate. They dragged him up the platform steps. Each one seemed to take an eternity. The herald stepped forward, unrolling a scroll. His voice carried across the square, amplified by the stone buildings that surrounded it. By order of His Majesty, this man, once prince, once son, has been found guilty of high treason. He conspired to overthrow the rightful crown, to sow discord among the faithful, to bring ruin upon the realm. For these crimes he is sentenced to public penitence and execution. Public penitence, a careful phrase. What followed was anything but careful. They strapped him to the rack. Even this simple act drew whimpers. The pressure on ruined wrists, the strain on broken fingers. The executioner checked each restraint twice, ensuring everything was secure. Then he looked up at the royal balcony where the ruler sat, face hidden in shadow, waiting a nod. The executioner began to turn the wheel. The rack worked slowly. That was its purpose. The first few turns merely created tension, pulling limbs taut. The prisoner gasped, but did and scream. Not yet another turn. The shoulders began to strain, joint sockets grinding against bone. Confess your crimes, the priest intoned, standing beside the platform. Name your serial conspirators and find mercy in death. But the prisoner said nothing. Perhaps he could end, perhaps there were no names to give, perhaps at this point confession would end, have mattered anyway. Another turn. This time something popped, a sound like green wood snapping. The prisoner's scream echoed off the buildings of the sky itself, a sound so raw that mothers in the crowd covered their children's ears, though they'd been forced to bring them, forced to teach them this lesson. The executioner paused, letting the moment breathe, letting the crowd absorb what they were witnessing. This wasn't about justice, it was about fear. About showing every noble, every merchant, every citizen with ambitions or doubts what happened when the crown felt threatened. They continued turn by turn, shoulder, elbow, hip, knee. The human body, it turns out, has numerous points of failure. The rack found them all, but the true horror was the physical destruction. It was the duration. They stretched it over 2 hours, breaking periodically, allowing him to remain conscious, to feel every moment. Physicians stood by, not to help, but to ensure he didn't die too quickly, to administer stimulants that kept him awake through agony, that should have granted the mercy of unconsciousness. Finally, when the executioner judged that the crowd had learned their lesson, when nobles on their balconies had turned away in disgust or fear, when even the guards looked sick, finally came the end, not through continued torture, but through a blade across the throat, quick, almost merciful by comparison to what had preceded it. His body went slack. The crowd released a collective breath. They hadn't realized they'd been holding. The herald spoke again. Let this be a lesson to all who would betray the crown. No mercy, no forgiveness, no remembrance, no remembrance. The final punishment, his name would be struck from official records, his image removed from family portraits. He would become unpersonally erased, as if he had never existed. They left his body on the platform for 3 days, warning a monument to fear. But as they would soon discover, erasing a person from parchment is easier than erasing them from memory, and the consequences of this public lesson would ripple far beyond anything the ruler had intended. Chapter 7. A kingdom unstitched. The execution was meant to restore order. Instead, it severed the final thread holding the realm together. Within a week, The first whispers began not in the capital, fear still held her tightly there, but in the provinces where distance granted a measure of safety. Tavern conversations turned dangerous. Did you hear what they did to the prince? Not the prince, not anymore. He had no name now, but everyone knew who they meant. The military commanders, already skeptical of the ruler's increasingly erratic decisions, withdrew to their garrisons. They didn't rebel, not openly. They simply stopped responding to summons quite as quickly. Delayed implementing orders, found reasons to remain in their fortresses rather than attend court. The reformed clerics, horrified by the old guard's participation in the execution, began holding secret councils. Not to plot rebellion, at least not initially, but to discuss, to debate whether a ruler who would torture his own son to death could still claim divine mandate. The merchant princes, always pragmatic, started moving their assets. Gold flowed across borders. Trade agreements were quietly renegotiated. If the realm was heading for collapse, they intended to be positioned advantageously when it came. And the ruler, sitting in his palace surrounded by advisors, too terrified to speak truth, genuinely believed he had secured his throne. He had demonstrated strength, made an example, restored fear. Surely that was enough, but fear is a brittle foundation. It holds only as long as the fear-maker remains strong, and he was not strong, not anymore. The paranoia that had driven him to destroy his own son now turned inward, consuming what remained of his judgment. He saw conspiracies in empty corridors, heard whispered threats in silence, trusted no one, not even the guards who stood outside his chambers, not even the food tasters who sampled his meals. He began making demands that made no sense, ordering arrests of people already dead, commanding executions for crimes that had never been defined. His inner council found themselves in an impossible position: obey his madness and accelerate the realm's collapse, or refuse and risk becoming his next victims. 3 months after the execution, the first province declared independence, not through warfare, but through simple abandonment. The provincial governor sent a letter, painfully polite, formally structured, explaining that due to administrative challenges and communication difficulties, his region would henceforth manage its own affairs. He pledged continued loyalty to the crown, of course. But loyalty without obedience is just words. 2 more provinces followed within the month. Foreign powers who had watched the execution with carefully neutral expressions now began making moves. Ambassadors were recalled, trade embargoes enacted, and along the borders troops began to gather, not for invasion, not yet, but as preparation, as opportunism, waiting for the right moment. The ruler issued demands for loyalty, threats of retribution, but demands from a weak throne are just noise inside the palace itself. Divisions hardened into chasms. The remaining heirs, there was still 2, both older, both having survived by being unremarkable, began attracting their own factions. Not because they were strong, but because they were alternatives. And in a collapsing dynasty, any alternative looks appealing. One night, 6 months after the execution, the ruler called for his spymaster, the same thin man with ink-stained fingers, who had verified the forged confession, who had helped orchestrate the destruction of an innocent prince. How could this happen? The ruler demanded, voice cracking. I did what was necessary. I removed the threat. Why is everything falling apart? The spymaster, perhaps sensing his own days were numbered, decided to speak truth just once. Because, Your Majesty, there was no threat. There never was, and everyone knows it. The ruler stared at him, uncomprehending. He confessed. He screamed words. That's not the same thing. Then who? The spymaster smiled sadly. Does it matter now? The ruler had him executed the next morning for treason. The official record stated, in truth, for honesty. But the damage was done. The machine of paranoia and fear that the ruler had built, that had consumed his son, was now consuming him. Every decision made from suspicion, every action taken from weakness, had compounded into systemic failure. The dynasty, which had survived for generations through brutality and cunning, now teetered on the edge, not because of external enemies, not because of legitimate threats, but because a frightened old man had mistaken his own shadow for a monster and destroyed his kingdom, trying to kill it, and somewhere In the unmarked grave where they dethrone the prince's broken body, something like justice waited. Not divine justice, not poetic justice, but the simple physics of collapse. What you build on fear will eventually be buried by it. Chapter 8. Echoes of the mutilated centuries have passed since that morning in the square. The dynasty fell eventually, not with dramatic revolution, but with pathetic whimper, the last ruler dying alone in a crumbling palace attended by no one. The capital itself changed names, changed rulers, changed languages. The platform where the execution took place was torn down, built over, forgotten by all except historians who sift through dusty records looking for footnotes. But the story didn't die. It could end because what happened in that stone chamber on that rack in that public square wasn't unique. It was pattern, a template repeated across centuries, across borders, across cultures. The names change, the weapons evolve, but the fundamental equation remains: power plus paranoia equals innocent suffering. Modern historians, when they stumbled across fragments of the story, struggled with it. The records had been largely destroyed, that edict of no remembrance had been taken seriously. But traces remained. A merchant's diary that mentioned the execution, a foreign ambassador's report describing the unfortunate incident with the prince, archaeological evidence of hasty grave sites. Slowly, painstakingly, they reconstructed what happened, and with reconstruction came questions: why, what was accomplished, who truly benefited? The answers, when they emerged, were uncomfortable. There was no plot. The confession had been forged. Even the official records, when cross-referenced with other documents, revealed contradictions too glaring to ignore. The prince had been exactly what he appeared: a minor royal caught in forces beyond his control, destroyed because his existence had become inconvenient. And the ruler who ordered his torture, he gained nothing. His dynasty collapsed. His name became synonymous with cruelty and madness. His legacy, a cautionary tale told to frighten children and instruct princes on how not to govern. But here's what makes the story truly haunting: it keeps happening. Different countries, different centuries, a political prisoner tortured for information. He doesn't have a scapegoat, paraded before cameras, forced to confess to crimes written by his accusers. Disappearances, show trials, public executions, designed not for justice, but for messaging. The tools have evolved. We've replaced racks with electrodes, public squares with state television. We've learned to torture with precision, to break minds, instead of just bodies, to erase people from existence, not with axes, but with algorithms. But the fundamental logic remains unchanged. Those in power, when threatened or insecure, will sacrifice the innocent to maintain control, and they all convince themselves it is necessary, justified, regrettable, but required. The prince's name, whatever it was, is lost to history. We know his title, his approximate age, the manner of his death. But the person he was, his hopes, his thoughts, his humanity, that was erased with bureaucratic efficiency, yet in a way that makes him everyone, every victim of political paranoia. Every person caught between factions they didn't choose, every soul destroyed by systems that value power over truth. His hands were cut off. That part is historically verified. Archaeological evidence even suggests the method. But the true amputation was deeper. They tried to cut him out of memory, to sever him from history itself. They failed. Because hands can be cut of bodies, can be broken, names can be struck from records, and faces erased from portraits. But the truth, the simple, terrible truth about what power does when it is afraid, that has a way of reaching forward through time, it leaves echoes, shadows, lessons that every generation must learn again. In the end, the prince's suffering became a message after all, just not the one his executioners intended. It stands as permanent testimony that cruelty, no matter how officially sanctioned, how legally justified, how politically necessary it appears, always reveals more about the powerful than the powerless. That the torturer's legacy outlasts the tortured, but not in the way they hoped. And that history eventually remembers, not perfectly, not completely, but enough to keep asking: how many times will we repeat this? How many hands must be severed before we recognize the pattern? The answers remain unwritten, but the questions, like the echo of screams in that stone chamber, refuse to fade.